Oh, hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. I've got an eerie sense that things are not quite what they appear to be. Stacy.
In fact, we're going to look out at California first, and then we're going to go to a town right here in New York, and that is Kingston, New York, where our guest in the second half is from. And it's a tale of two economic models. Over in California, we know not only do we have forest fires going on all over the place, huge fires, thousands of people being evacuated from their homes, but we see blackouts, millions of people suffering blackouts, and PG&E, the multinational basically utility, the giant utility company listed on the stock exchange, they have declared bankruptcy to avoid all their obligations over the last year's disaster. And it looks like we have disaster again this year. And people in California are not happy with the blackouts. Stop harassing PG&E workers, Gavin Newsom says. They didn't create this mess. Amid reports of Pacific Gas and Electric Company workers being threatened and run off the road, Governor Gavin Newsom urged Californians to save their outrage for the utility's corporate owners and treat workers on the ground with respect. Over 1 million people and businesses have their blackouts, essentially, and people are getting angry and they see PG&E utility trucks and they throw stuff at them or they're trying to drive them off the road.
You see, this is actually where capitalism fails. We have this debate about capitalism versus socialism. It's very big in the coming election. And in the areas of the economy like utilities, you have a distinct preference for the role of government. Why? In the case of PG&E, they are a private corporation in the business of providing a utility, electricity, and whenever they get in trouble, they just declare bankruptcy. So it's an asymmetric warfare going on. They extract wealth, and when they get caught doing bad stuff, they simply say, oh, we're going to go bankrupt. And as a result, you've got these enormous wildfires burning, you've got the economy endangered, you've got people's lives endangered, because as private corporations, they know how to game the system in a way to absolve them from any responsibility and to not pay for what are called in economics the externalities of their business model. The utilities should not be in private hands, transportation should not be in private hands, education and medical health services should not be in private hands for this reason, because you've got gouging and monopolization in the private sector. It's not appropriate for these basic core utilities of the economy.
Our corporate structure today is one of private equity. It extracts the equity and it leaves a carcass of debt. That is indeed what you see here. But the other thing you see, especially in California, is the woke progressives have basically enabled a tax regime whereby they always win. So in California, the property taxes for those who have been there, for the past 10, 20 years are extremely low. And they've passed laws long ago where you're not allowed to raise taxes. So the cost of maintaining the infrastructure in regards to the utilities, they don't have enough taxes anyway to cover the maintenance on it. And so it is the corporations, it is the government, and it is the taxpayers across the United States who have helped hollow out the infrastructure that was provided and paid for by the previous generation. And I'm going to talk about this because there is an actual word for it, and that is called technical debt. The toxic bubble of technical debt threatening America. Climate change will soon expose a crippling problem embedded in the nation's infrastructure. In fire-ravaged California, it already has. A kind of toxic debt is embedded in much of the infrastructure that America built during the 20th century. For decades, corporate executives, as well as city, county, state, and federal officials, not to mention voters, have decided against doing the routine maintenance and deeper upgrades to ensure that electrical systems, roads, bridges, dams, and other infrastructure can function properly under a range of conditions. Kicking the can down the road like this is often seen as the profit-maximizing or politically expedient option, but it's really borrowing against the future without putting that debt on the books.
Right, so it's a deferred obligation or deferred debt, I guess, another word for technical debt. So if you're not willing to maintain the infrastructure and it's eroding underneath the surface, you have this Potemkin village of an economy going on in California, but behind the facade is a decaying, decrepit, technical debt amassing problem. And in the case of PG&E, it's obviously falling apart. And when it does, it causes these enormous wildfires. But nobody wants to look at the wildfires and say the obvious. Number one, the taxes are being misused. They're not being adequately distributed to where they are needed on the infrastructure side because there's a government failure. Number two, climate change, regardless of whether you believe it's happening or not, the damage that is going to be applied to your pocketbook, that you will pay for climate change whether you believe it or not. You know, it's still, the price is still there. Regardless of your orthodoxy, it's still going to cost you money. And PG&E is a perfect example of this. I hope those who are climate change deniers are on the front lines. They're battling with the buckets of water, saying, oh, it's not happening. Oh, my house is on fire.
Yes, there is climate change. Yes, there is global warming. Yes, they do have bigger droughts and longer droughts. But on the other hand, we as a society refuse to plan. We do not believe in plans because that is socialism here. So we do not plan for, when you're building all these suburbs, how do you deal with the fire risk that is inherent to the climate of California? So how do you deal with all that brush fire risk that used to, for hundreds and thousands of years of Native Americans living there, like what they used to do is let the fires burn, and that helps with the nutrients in the soil, and it helps keep the forest safe and robust. Now we're not allowed to plan for the fact that these huge subdivisions and suburbs are developing. Nobody is allowed to talk about what to do with a fire. And of course, nobody wants even the tiniest of fire to burn, even though it will save everybody, because they themselves don't want that fire near their house.
Right, well, it's hubris, right? I mean, people in California, they're being gifted hundreds of billions of dollars from the central bank for free, and they make superhero movies all day, and they believe that they're inflammable, that fire doesn't touch them, that they are immortal, and that only mere mortals are being affected by fire. And they really believe that. They've got a serious God complex, and they'll believe that all the way down to the size of a small cinder where previously the person existed.
According to the article, it will cost $3.2 trillion to upgrade the U.S. infrastructure just to safe standards, not even to make it advanced like they have in Asia, for example, or parts of Europe. It's just to maintain the infrastructure.
I think what we're going to see are more of these Enron type situations where companies vaporize in a matter of hours. I think we're going to see that with whole counties in California. They're simply going to vaporize the economy, like Robert Citron, remember that in Orange County. The whole pension system vaporized in a matter of hours. This will be the case more and more, and at the same time, there will be a greater and greater reliance on believing in the supernatural as the cause of the problems, and not the fact that it's just greed and hubris.
It's not just the corporations. It is definitely not just them. Every single individual is acting like that. Every individual went to the voting booth and they decided not to allocate any funds towards maintenance of the system. They did go there and they did tick the box that sees California has one of the highest rates of their budget go towards prisons. They have huge, vast prison industrial complex there. They spend a fortune on their prisoners there, something like $50,000, $60,000. Some locations, it costs $300,000 a year to incarcerate some of their inmates. So, they're willing to allocate money for that. These are the sort of choices that are going to happen when these technical debts come to light. People are going to say, do I want to lock up a whole bunch of people? Do I want to spend $300,000 to lock up some kid who stole a slice of pizza? Or do I want to perhaps make sure that my house doesn't burn down and all my possessions and all of my nostalgic sort of, things, inheritance from my parents and grandparents? Do I want my children to be safe and maybe their school not burned down? Like, what do I prefer? That is my hatred for the guy who stole the pizza greater than my love for my own life?
The prisons are new structures, new buildings, so they might be the only safe place left when the fires really hit, and everybody who voted for more prisons will be hankering to get into the prison because it'll be the only safe structure left. And meanwhile, their house is on a mudslide being swallowed up by an earthquake on fire.
California looks like they're in for at least a decade of blackouts because of PG&E, because of the technical debt, because voters from the past and the corporation has decided to use dividends and share buybacks instead. So this is all of us in the society and this economy are guilty of it. This is how we've decided as a collective of individuals and corporations to run our economy, and this is what it looks like. Some people are opting out and have been developing new economic models, localism, and this is one thing that a lot of our guests have always argued that is the future, and including Gerald Celente, and the town he comes from, Kingston, New York, is in the news. The U.S. city preparing itself for the collapse of capitalism. From a festival that helps artists trade work for healthcare to a regional microcurrency, Kingston is trying to build an inclusive and self-sufficient local ecosystem. There's a revolution going on in Kingston, they say. They have this O positive, which was a carnival that was basically brought out where artists could trade their art for healthcare because of the U.S. healthcare system, which is, as we've gone over many times, is dilapidated. But Kingston's anti-capitalist, anti-establishment healthcare network is just one example of a model that could supplant corporate America. Locals have launched a non-commercial radio station, Radio Kingston, WKNY, with widely representative, hyper-local programming that broadcasts via power generators if the grid goes dark. A regional microcurrency called the Hudson Valley Current now exists too, according to co-founder David McCarthy. Create an ecosystem that includes everyone.
Right, well, it's deglobalization, right? That means that the era post-World War II of globalizing and synchronizing the global economy is breaking apart for all the reasons we're talking about with PG&E and overweaned corporations from free money. Now, on the local level, this is all fracturing. It's all breaking apart and becoming self-sufficient, and people want to have individual sovereignty. They're developing their own currencies. Globally, we see Bitcoin as the currency of choice for those looking for self-sovereignty, and even various countries now are looking for cryptocurrency and Bitcoin to fall away from the dollar, fall away from the SWIFT movement. Speaking of falling away, we have to fall away from this sentence and move into a break. And when we come back, more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to a very, very special guest, Gerald Celente from trendsresearch.com. Gerald, welcome back.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
So Kingston, I mean, aside from being a fashion plate from Kingston, you work in the Kingston chic look. I know it's sweeping the globe, internationally accepted now as really the chicest style in town. Kingston, there's a lot going on in Kingston. Tell us about the community there. You've got a local currency, radical decentralized healthcare, cooperatives, local radio, agriculture. What's going on in Kingston? This is exciting stuff.
Yeah, you know, it was the first capital of New York State, and the seeds of democracy were sown there. So it still has that element of freedom. And it's the most historic Four Corners in America. You were there, you and Stacy, and you see the beauty of it. And it's just rediscovered now.
But the way this is being talked about is like they're getting ready for a collapse, and folks are receding, and they're just getting their own farming, their own currency, their own everything is becoming like self-sufficient.
Self-sufficient. I don't think they're getting ready for the collapse because a lot of rich people are coming up there and they're really building the place up. But it's a place where you can express your own ideals and beliefs without anybody telling you what you should believe. So there's that mutual respect that everyone up there has for each other rather than one rule.
Gorgeous up there. We've been up there. We'll probably visit again. There's an excellent French restaurant up there. What's the name of that place?
La Canache.
Oh la, c'est formidable. Okay, so let's talk about America, California, blackouts, homelessness. Medieval diseases are coming back in California. They haven't seen these diseases since the Middle Ages. What is going on? The trend, as you might say, not looking good. What's happening?
The world's on fire, not only in California, Indonesia, Amazon, not only those fires. Look at what's going on in Chile. How about Bolivia? You've been down to Colombia lately? Let's go to Ecuador. Maybe Algeria. No, Lebanon. How about Iraq? Hey, Hong Kong. Maybe Spain. The people have had it. When people lose everything and have nothing left to lose, they lose it. And they're losing it, whether they're losing their freedom or losing their money. And so we're seeing these rebellions. The world is on fire. In my life, I've never seen anything like this before. And it's, again, the protests are also against the 1%. Because that's all this monetary methadone that the central banks have shoved into the system. It's only kept the bull running. Everybody else has gone down. And so that's what you're seeing going on. The world is on fire physically, emotionally, and spiritually.
Right, we call it the global insurrection against banker occupation. And going back to 2008, when you had Occupy Wall Street and all these other protests started to percolate. But there was a direct focus on Wall Street and the financiers and the money folks and the banks. It seems like the protesters around the world are starting to understand that their common enemy are the central banks around the world that are just printing money for the 1% or the 1/10 of 1%. And they leave everyone else behind. I call it, I don't see what you think about this phrase, interest rate apartheid. If you're a friend of the bankers, you get unlimited money at 0% or less. If you're not a friend of the bankers, you have to pay 16%, 18%, or at a payday lender, 2,000, 3,000% annualized rates of return. Is that a common theme for these protests around the world? Can you connect those dots, or am I missing something?
No, you've made it perfectly clear. I just call it all we've become are plantation workers on the multinational plantation of Slavelandia. Because that's all globalization has done. It's concentrated the wealth. Oh, the equity markets are going up. You mentioned about all the cheap money coming in. What do they do with that cheap money? Oh, they either buy back their stocks or buy up other companies. When we were young guys, there were no hedge funds and private equity groups owning everything. And that's all the people are. They're plantation workers on Slavelandia. And it's better than the old plantation system because we don't have to feed you. We don't have to house you. We'll just give you enough money. Get back here tomorrow and go get something to eat, and we'll see you in a couple of hours.
Yeah, it seems like when workers at General Motors are lobbying or protesting for more wages, they're positioned and they are characterized as ingrates and parasites on this economy. But when Jamie Dimon or James Cramer is throwing a hissy fit and a crybaby fit, as he did, to get the Fed to print more money, he's lauded as a hero, as a man of the people by his antics to have more money printed. There's a real disconnect between labor and the financiers. There's $3.5 trillion collected in taxes last year, all inclusive in America. It only paid for 3/4 of the operating budget of America. We went into $1 trillion into debt. But in fact, that money is not even needed. I make the comparison to Saudi Arabia. The reason you have a slave class in Saudi Arabia is because the princes, when they need more, they just pump more oil. This oligarchy class, when they need more money, they just print more money. They don't need the workers. They don't need even that $3.5 trillion. Their workers are completely superfluous. That's why so many of them are defecating on the street and dying. The life expectancy in America is gone down. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, it is. And again, you mentioned General Motors. Let's not forget, General Motors was too big to fail. Let's give them money and let's make sure their CEO makes, tens of millions of dollars a year. And we're going to limit the amount of money that the new workers could make. And again, don't call this capitalism. People are complaining that, we may turn into a socialist country. This isn't capitalism anymore. There's no such thing in capitalism is too big to fail. And you mentioned the homeless crisis. This is just the beginning of it. This thing is going to explode. There's going to be homeless everywhere. Again, people are flooding out of South America, flooding out of Africa, flooding out of the Middle East. Poverty, violence, corruption, no future, wars. The homeless problem is going to be out of control in a city and a country near you.
But same with it. Detroit, Baltimore, New York, San Francisco, LA, they're streaming from the locals, from Americans. They're not needed. My point is, workers are not needed. No. People are not needed. If you could print money, why would you bother feeding somebody that you could just as easily put them in prison and make money from the prison industrial complex, right? Speaking of prisoners, Jamie Dimon, after you and I have been talking about this for years, that he's been involved in racketeering and market rigging in the precious metals markets. And we said, this should be prosecuted under RICO, the anti-racketeering law. Finally, the Department of Justice is going after Jamie for racketeering. It has been proven that he was manipulating prices, as we've been saying for years now. Where's this going to go?
The same place where it went when, 6 major banks were convicted of fraud. And remember that guy under the Obama administration, Eric Holder? They were too big to jail. But you make sure that you don't go over the speed limit 6 miles an hour. You didn't have your signal light on. Where'd you come from? Did you have a drink? Get out of the car, stand on your head and repeat the alphabet backwards.
No, how about
That's why you're seeing the revolutions going on around the world, because the bigs are getting a free ride while everybody else gets tied up and brought down.
Well, Wells Fargo caught stealing money from thousands and thousands of customer accounts. Warren Buffett, biggest shareholder. And yet that was positioned also as a heroic act of capitalism to allow this larceny to go on unchecked.
Yeah, so that's where it's going to go with Jamie Dimon.
Nowhere.
Nowhere.
He'll be made Fed chairman. He'll be made a Treasury secretary. He could be president of the United States. He's such a big larcenistic scum, he could be president of the United States. That's the track he's on.
Well, you have to also be a pathological liar to be a president of any country. So maybe he could fit that very well.
Yeah, I can see it now. Now, in the finance markets, they do have some areas that are out of the direct control of the kleptocrats, and that would be in the repo market, the short-term money market for banks. And that has flashing distress. Like we didn't see it as bad in 2008. It wasn't as bad in 1929 or 1921. We've never actually seen this short-term credit market between banks as distressed and signaling as big a problem as we do right now. Why is that? If the stock market's making new all-time highs and Apple's making new all-time highs, how come the repo market's flashing these problems?
You mean they're only pumping in $120 billion a day into them? Yeah. And they also just another $60 billion a month in what we're not going to call it quantitative easing. We'll make up another name for it because they need the money to keep the addiction going. Look at the debt levels around the world of corporations and governments. So they need this money to keep the gambling game going. That's all it's about to us.
Remember when James Cramer at CNBC threw a hissy fit to get the Fed to print more money back in 2008 during the credit freeze? Trump went to school on that because he, on Twitter, daily starts his crybaby routine for Jay Powell or Jerome Powell to print more and cut rates more to keep this Ponzi scheme going. It's kind of embarrassing to see the president, though, throw a hissy fit like Chihuahua at the bowl of, some Paris Hilton's Chihuahua. He reminds me of Paris Hilton's Chihuahua in the bag, being carried around and yapping for a snack. It's like, give me more money, give me more money. Is it? You've been around for a while, I've been around for a while. Is it kind of embarrassing to see the president beg like this?
Well, he's in the real estate business, and he knows if interest rates go up, his business goes down, and it's the presidential reality show, and he's only interested in getting reelected. And what the general consensus is now is that the Federal Reserve is not going to raise interest rates again this year and probably not next year. We're saying that by a year from November, you're going to see interest rates in the United States at 0 or negative. He has the pressure to do it, and he's going to keep putting pressure on them, and I believe they're going to do it because it's the only thing that's keeping the global economies up are interest rates going into negative and 0 interest rate policy. And you're a great guy, Max Keiser. I got this 30-year bond for you, and I want you to buy it, and in 30 years when you cash it in, because you're such a great guy, I'm going to give you less than what you paid for. We're going to call it negative yields. So is this a freak show with Trump? It's a freak show everywhere.
The global freak show.
Yeah.
You mentioned negative interest rates, and this is truly an anomaly in the history of finance. There's never been negative interest rates ever since, going back to the Bronze Age. You never find negative interest rates, and it implies that time has not zero value, but time has negative value. All of finance is based on having an interest rate, let's say the 10-year bond. Everything is based on what is my interest on this investment going forward, and then that's how I compare one investment to another. It's based on the implied rate of return. If money itself has a negative rate of return, then actually nothing has a value. And does this mean Goldman Sachs has figured out how to go backwards in time and steal money from people in the past?
A good question. Oh, by the way, this is why gold prices are going to keep going up.
Yes, tell us.
Yeah, because of all this cheap money that they're printing up. Oh, how about in Switzerland? Minus 0.75% interest rate. A negative 0.75% 0.75% interest rate, and they're saying they're going to keep going it longer. So now, what happens to the average person? Where do you put your money? How do you get a savings? You don't. And that's why they keep forcing you to try to go into the equity markets.
But isn't that confiscation? In other
Of
words, if I
course it is.
give
That's what it is.
$1 million into the bank and they take three quarters of a percentage point negative rate, and then they give it to their guy who's speculating in the property market, aren't they confiscating from me to give it to their client in the mortgage market?
Well, all you are is a worker on the multinational plantation of Slavelandia. So, of course, that's
Slavelandia, I love it.
Yeah.
I don't want to go there, though. Hey, stick around for another segment. Thanks for being on this one. Gerald Celente.
Thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Gerald Celente of the Trends Journal. If you want to catch us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.